Hello, Yakri here with another Dominions 5 video. So I want to talk about communions this time. So communions are a thing you can do with astral and blood mages, and with the use of certain magical items that allow you to boost the magic paths of the communion master mage involved by slaving other mages to them. They also distribute the fatigue from the spells that they cast to the other mages in the communion. Now, there's some more complicated things with it, like, let's see, mages. If you cast a spell and your communion master mage has the pathing to cast that spell, but the communion slaves do not, it increases the amount of fatigue taken by the communion slaves. And there might be some other more complex calculations that go into it that I'm forgetting about, but I don't think so off the top of my head. And what happens is that for every geometrically increasing amount of communion slaves, starting with 2, that you have in the communion, the paths of the master are boosted by +1 to all the magic paths that they actually have. So if you have 2 communion slaves, your communion master is boosted by +1 in all their paths. And if you have 4 slaves, they're boosted by +2, 8 slaves by +3, and so on. Communion slaves, there's one other exception, which is that, what is it? Lady Pythium, I think? There's one nation that has these non-commander units called third communicants, and they count as communion slaves, which can allow you to have quite a large number of communion slaves in an army, a very unusually high number, to do some really crazy shenanigans with it. But otherwise, they have to be actual mages, right? Now, you can, what I was saying with blood mages. So let's look here. No, I'm gonna have to look in research because I haven't researched it. Okay, so we've got Sabbath Master. So Sabbath Master and Sabbath Slave are the same as Communion Master and Communion Slave, except that they have an increased fatigue cost, and they require blood slaves to be sacrificed to begin them. And you can, or at least you could in Dominions 4, and I don't believe anything has changed, mix and match. So you can have a bunch of Astral Communion Slaves to one Sabbath Master. That would be a relatively common thing, right? I probably should have done that for this demonstration because it would have been kind of cool to work this guy into it. But I've got a bunch of units, and I'm going to go get them into a fight, and hopefully this will go well and show off the power of communions. But, I don't really have any way to script this ahead of time, so it could just be a disaster. And we're going to cast a variety of spells that my mages couldn't cast if they weren't in a communion, and hopefully give us a nice battle replay that I'll be able to go over and show you how communions affected things, right? Now let's see, what else do you need to know about communions before we get started? I think the key thing here is, so when you look in the scripting for the unit, right, I've set it to cast spells, and Summon Earth Power and Summon and Strength of Gaia are spells this unit can't normally cast, right? Like, because Strength of Gaia takes 3 Nature Magic, and I don't have 3 Nature Magic. Now, I think I've queued up at least 8 Communion Slaves, which means that this Yakshini here is going to have 3 Nature Magic, 3 Earth Magic, 6 Water Magic, and 3 Astral Magic, right, when she's casting spells. So that's going to be no problem to cast Strength of Gaia. And here's the other thing. These spells affect all of your communion slaves, right? Now, so that means if you, say, have communion slaves, and let's say all of them have Earth 1, and you cast Summon Earth Power, that will boost the Earth Magic of all your communion slaves by 1. And this will also help reduce fatigue on them in certain cases, right? Where I was talking about if they don't have the... Wait, does that actually work? I think that's how they work, right? It'll reduce fatigue on them because of the disparity between the magic paths will be less. But I could be wrong. In any case, Summon Earth Power ends up being very useful anyway because it gives reinvigoration to all your communion slaves. Now, since fatigue is spread out among all the communion slaves, they are dissipating that fatigue with reinvigoration, again spread out among all of them, is going to be much more effective, right? Like, so if 5 communion slaves get 5 fatigue each, and each of them has 3 reinvigoration, right? You're going to end up spreading out 2 fatigue to each slave at the end of the turn. The turns are real time, but there's still a sort of a turn time unit in the game. So any sort of reinvigoration like that is very useful. The other thing is that when your communion slaves hit 200 fatigue, which they can do because you could have multiple communion masters, right? And the communion masters will take one portion of fatigue each, and the slaves will also take one portion of fatigue each per communion master casting spells, right? The communion masters themselves don't gain fatigue from other communion masters casting spells, and you can have multiple communion masters, although there can only be one communion per battlefield, right? Okay, so what this means is that once you hit 200 fatigue with any unit, you'll start taking damage from additional fatigue, right? And it's like 1 damage per 10 fatigue. So if you have your communions, I think you can only take up to 1 damage per instance of fatigue gain, right? So when your communion masters cast a spell, your communion slaves will take 1 damage, right, for that spell cast, if they already have maxed out fatigue. So if you have regeneration, and your regeneration rating 2 hit points a turn, you only have 1 communion master, your communion slave should, in theory, never die. And if you have 2 masters, they still shouldn't ever die. So giving them regeneration is quite valuable. One strategy you can do potentially is to have what is sometimes called a turbo bless, where you have just a couple communion slaves and you really run them into the ground with a couple communion masters. And you would do this with nature magic and a bless, or just the bless, but really it's more dramatic when you have nature magic and the bless. Let's say you have a human-sized unit, has at least 11 hit points, and you use regeneration, the spell, and you have a regeneration bless that's going to regenerate 4 hit points per turn. So you have 2 communion slaves, and you give them 4 communion masters, and so those communion masters will all take greatly reduced fatigue for casting spells because they have higher spell pathing, and because the fatigue is being shared out to the communion slaves, and the communion slaves should, in theory, not die. I'm not sure if this is going to work exactly the same way in Dominions 5 entirely. I haven't messed with Communions much since I started playing Dominions 5 and since it came out, but it should probably work more or less the same way. And the key things to keep in mind are the advantage of being able to cast bigger spells that you can't normally cast. So let's see, I've got one of these mages queued up with something a little more notable. Actually, I think he can... Maybe it's not that notable, because I think he can cast Curse of Stones normally. Alright, so he couldn't actually cast Curse of Stones normally. So, a Earth 3 mage could cast Curse of Stones if... 300 fatigue means you can't cast it just on your own. You need to boost in some way. So, with 4 Earth Gems... Maybe it isn't that good an example, but it was hard to set up a communion game for it. But basically, you would need to cast Summon Earth Power first, and that would, if you were already Earth 3, and that would get you to the point where you can then cast Curse of Stones. It only uses up 150% or 150 fatigue, which is actually possible, and the spell cast successfully. I think it can still be over 100. It might actually need to be under 100, in which case you'd need 4 Earth Gems and to summon Earth Power. With the Communions, you actually only need Communion Master, and then you could just cast it immediately, right? We don't do that because we can summon Earth Power, and it's going to spread out more fatigue. And then Maws of the Earth. Okay, so here's an example of how you can benefit from this, even if you could cast the spell anyway, right? The benefits are a little more limited. Maybe you just want to have a bunch of mages casting the spell without being in a communion, right? Because creating a communion does, of course, eat up communion slaves, which are a resource, and they could potentially cast spells of their own, right? And for this nation, for Kaelasa, it's less of a problem because you get these cheap Astral 1 mages to make as communion slaves. But for other nations, you have to use valuable mages as communion slaves, so it's less of a good strategy unless you have a very good reason of using it. Very good reason for using it. Now, the nice thing, though, is these pluses, right, in the spell are going to be boosted for every magic path level, right? You have beyond the requirements of the spell in the major magic path required for it. So this would be Earth. Now, since a communion like this will boost your pathing by 3, and you're casting Summon Earth Power, a Earth 3 mage is going to be at equivalent of Earth 7. Now, this spell requires Earth 3 to cast, which means we're going to get a +4 bonus. So 4 to the area of effect, 4 to the damage done in that area of effect, and 5 to the range for each one. So you're going to be able to cast all the way across the battlefield, right? Because it's going to be +20 range. So that's very good. for obvious reasons. There are other spells that similarly are boosted very effectively by this. Oh yeah, let's go down here. So Howl is an example of properly using communions, as it were, because this requires nature 3 and it's 300 fatigue, and this guy is nature 1, but he will go up to nature 4, and he has plenty of gems, so he shouldn't have any problem casting it, right? And because also, of course, I forgot to mention earlier, the fatigue is again shared, right, between all the units, so he's not even going to, he would take 150 fatigue, right, from after the boost, right, without spending a gem, because you can spend one gem, nature gem, right? Mage is going to spend a nature gem, or any, whatever type of gem, to increase their magic path by 1 for fatigue purposes when casting a spell, if you didn't know that. Anyway, so he would take 150 or 75 if he spent a gem fatigue from that, but instead he's going to take like 20 or something total when it's spread out amongst the communion. Okay, so we're going to go try and get in a fight with Therados, who is invading us at the moment. And this is just kind of like a little shitty game I set up specifically for the purpose of getting in a fight and showing off communions. And hopefully I can go over the details in the battle log. Really, this is just going to be more illustrations of how this works, assuming it works correctly. Let's see. Hopefully I didn't burn through too many magic gems, killing all those guys. Yep, still looks pretty okay. Did we leave anyone behind? No. Alright. Good. Alright, Therados' army is over there. Hopefully they want to fight us, and then that'll make this a lot easier. I do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfect. Alright. Boop, boop, boop. Dang, it's taking a while. Alright, hopefully that means there was a big battle. Okay. That's not a huge battle, but it should have triggered our spells. So let's see how this works. I didn't set those troops up very well. So these guys all cast Communion Slave and Communion Master, and then we're going to have them start casting their first spells, and that's generally going to be buffs, right? I'm casting buffs so that I can buff up the Communion. Now, as you can see, these Communion Slaves now have 20 protection because one of these guys cast Iron Skin. They've got Reinvigoration because of the Summon Earth power, and they've been blessed as well, giving them Bark Skin and Fortitude. Bark Skin, of course, doesn't actually do anything except make them susceptible to fire, but the Piercing, Slashing, and Blunt Resistant is pretty handy. Now, particularly of note is that this is going to protect you from battlefield damage spells like... Alright, let me pause for a second here. It's going to protect you from battlefield damage spells like Earthquake and... what's the word I'm looking for? Rain of Stones, right? So Rain of Stones, of course, causes stones to fall from the sky, and it has a good chance of hitting units in the head with blunt damage. Now, for these guys, they normally, your natural protection is 1, and they don't wear hats, so that would be like 7 blunt damage to the head. They have 9 hit points, so they're actually pretty terrible for Turbo Communions. And that has a good chance. Actually, that is going to almost certainly kill them in a single hit, right? Fortunately, in Dominions 5, spells have casting speed, and spells like big spells like Rain of Stones have been slowed down. So you're going to be able to get your Communion off, and hopefully drop buffs before that can land, and this is going to protect you from that. So now you have 20 protection. There's a good chance that on a headshot from Rain of Stones you take no damage at all. If you manage to add in Body Ethereal, you'll be pretty much completely protected, and of course with Slashing Resistant, Blunt Resistant, Regeneration, there's no trouble there at all. Now to note, the Slashing, Piercing, Blunt Resistant, that's from a Bless, but I do have a Water Mage in this Communion, and I could have done what's it called, Liquid Form instead to get the same effect. And I could have had someone else cast Iron Skin, right? Okay. Now, let's see. What spells have been cast? Curse of Stones is being cast. Someone cast... This spell here is Blade Wind, which is another great spell to cast in a Communion. It can be devastating against sort of lightly armored or chaff units to just wipe out a bunch of them. These are almost essentially as good as crossbow bolts each, right? In a big wave. And it's boosted fairly decently by having higher caster level, and it's pretty fatigue intensive. But if you can spam it by way of having a communion to boost up your mage pads, it's very good, right? All right, so we've got Howl now. This is causing wolves to spawn from the sides of the battlefield. Not actually super powerful, but kind of a good distractionary. I was trying to say distractionary spell. All right, now let's look over here. Look at all these elementals. They're sitting around like chumps, and probably aren't going to accomplish anything in this particular battle because it's not a tough enough fight, right? They're going to just sit behind these units and they're going to get mopped up and not much is going to happen, right? But if this were a tougher battle, you would notice that these guys are really gnarly. Actually, these water elementals aren't that scary. This earth elemental, though, pretty spooky, right? 50 hit points, regeneration 10%, okay toughness, couple attacks. Water elementals are actually nice because they have a bunch of attacks. They murder things better, as it were, right? But they have a little bit poor resistance. If we were in cold temperature scales, they'd actually be ice elementals, which are a little bit scarier for these purposes. And our sacred units are mostly cleaning things up. If I had a different bless, I might use, or had better research pads, I might use my communions to cast spells like mass protection, or if we were in the very late game, things like Army of Lead, Army of Gold. These are spells that are pretty intensive to cast. It's hard to get a mage big enough to cast them without something like communions or building a lot of items. And at least compared to building a ton of items or summoning a mage with higher magic paths to enable you to cast these big spells that require like Earth 5 or Nature 5 or somewhere in that range, communions are a very cheap option compared to that. What are these guys called? Yogini, right? Yogis. The yogis are like 55 gold, right? For one of these guys. So, you recruit them from any of your forts off of your capital. So, you recruit. Let's put this. Oh, the battle's over. So you recruit a bunch of yogis, say like 10 of them or, 16 of them even, and you can go and cast those big battlefield magic spells. And that's what communions are really good at, right? Is getting you sort of cheap or cost-effective access to spells like that, right? Like, let's look up here in alteration, like really farther on. So mass protection is actually very cheap at Nature 3, but I don't think you get anyone with Nature 3 to cast it. So you could have a booster, of course, or you could use just 2 cheap mages in a communion to allow you to cast the spell. And not only would they allow you to cast the spell, but if we take a look at the requirements of that spell, right, where is it? There it is. So it has a 100 fatigue cost, right? So you can cast this spell in your communion and have very little fatigue gained at all, actually, and then you could cast another spell after it, like, hey, why not cast that? Maybe cast Creeping Doom a couple times, right? Spawn a bunch of insects and that kind of thing, right? So that's what we can be really good about it. What are some of the other higher level examples? Yeah, so like we're all the way up at 9 magic. We've got stuff like Army of Gold and Lead, which are 5 earth. Yes, 5 earth. Or Army of Rats. This is a really nasty one. The entire enemy army shrinks in size, have their hit points and morale reduced. This is kind of I don't know if it's necessarily the best thing, but it's kind of a fun one, and you could potentially do it in retreat from battle just to kind of screw over your opponent. Oh, that's new. Time stop, right? There's some really good things in other magic pads as well. I don't know if I do communions for this, but bone grinding is a really nasty battlefield magic as well. Fog warriors, this is a good example of one if we had access to any air magic, and I don't know, Kael'thasa might be able to summon some mages with air magic. And if we could weasel in an air mage into a communion, casting Mistform would be fantastic. It affects the entire battlefield. All your friendly troops become super, super, super resistant to damage unless they're hit by a very heavy attack or a magic weapon. So if your enemies have like human-sized armies and they don't have magic weapons, this will make your army virtually unkillable. It causes you to take 1 damage from any attack that it doesn't break the spell's conditions, right? Absolutely crazy good. I believe in enchantment there's some really great stuff that are also good communion fodder. Like, let's see, is it... No, it's not an enchantment, is it? There's Phantasmal Army is what I was trying to find. I can't remember where it's hiding under. Maybe it was under this after all. Yeah, Phantasmal Army. So this scales up, yeah, 5 more illusions for every extra caster level. So the reason isn't so much because you can't, it's for air magic, it's hard to come by. So two units in a communion would be pretty decent, but hey, why not instead, put 8 units in your communion, boost an air 3 mage up from air 3 to air 4, 5, 6, and then maybe cast Storm. You still have plenty of fatigue left over. Cast Summon Storm Power. You're at air 7. Cast Phantasmal Army 3, 4, 5 times. I mean, at that point, you're getting a boost of, 4? So it's 4 times 5. 20 extra illusions. This almost doubles the effectiveness of the spell. This is a very effective spell if you don't have enough troops on the battlefield to bog people down. So you get the idea, right? Communions are very useful for casting anything you don't have enough magic pathing to access. That would be useful, really. Big battlefield spells of any kind, because of the reduction in fatigue, or rather spreading out of fatigue, and because they are often high path, and that means that you need to, you might need to boost up your magic pathing in order to access them at all, and it's really good for spells that scale effectively, right? Yeah. So I think that pretty much sums it up, and I hope that helps you understand communions a little better. I just really wanted to do this video because I noticed that now, on 2 different nations, I mentioned, I haven't really talked about communions yet, and I don't want to go into an entire communion tutorial on the specific nation video. So hopefully I'll do that some other time. I thought I should actually get around to it and explain them. There are some tricky shenanigans you can do with them, but that's pretty much the gist of it. I guess they're not really as mysterious as you might think. Just keep in mind that communions, as sort of a thing to rely on in combat, are rather fragile, right? If one of your communion slaves dies before you cast the spell that you needed to be boosted for, and you weren't overkilling it with the communion, then you might no longer be able to cast that spell, and your whole mage script will go off the rails. So that's a big problem. If your communion slaves are valuable, you need to be careful to not over-fatigue them and kill them by fatiguing them out in long fights. So that's another thing to bear in mind. If your communion master dies, you'll have a bunch of mages sitting around as communion slaves, being completely useless, and you'll be very sad. So just, be careful when setting up communions, and it's probably a good idea to use some sort of defensive spell as your first spell you have a communion master cast after forming a communion, if you have a good option. Potentially, of course, you can assess the situation. Maybe there's really no reason to be worried, but I like, slapping in something like Body Ethereal or Iron Skin or something like that, right? Possibly combined with Summon Earth Power if you have that option. Personal Regeneration, of course, being really good for the aforementioned reasons. All right, I think that's everything. Thank you for watching.